Hello there. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is great to meet you. To start things off, we have seen your portfolio and your academic projects, and we are excited to dive a bit deeper into your process. Since you are just starting your professional journey, we want to focus on your fundamental understanding of the pipeline and how you approach problem solving in animation and VFX. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I have been following the work your studio produces for a while now, so it is a bit surreal to actually be interviewing with you. I'm looking forward to talking about my work and learning more about how things operate in a professional environment.
That is wonderful to hear. Let us jump right in. Since you are coming from a fresh graduate perspective, I want to start with some of the core principles. Let us say you are working on a shot where a character is moving very quickly. You hit play, and the animation just looks unnatural or stiff. Which animation principles are usually being violated in that scenario, and how would you go about correcting it?
That is a classic struggle, right? Usually when fast movement feels robotic or stiff, it is because the principles of squash and stretch, anticipation and follow-through, and overlapping action are missing or underutilized. In fast movements, you actually need a bit of exaggeration to make the motion feel dynamic and believable to the human eye. If I were correcting it, I would first look at squash and stretch. Adding that flexibility gives the character a sense of weight and volume during the peak of the action. Then I would check the anticipation. If a character just snaps into a fast move without a wind-up, it feels jarring. I would add a clear preparation pose to tell the audience the movement is about to happen. Finally, I would focus on follow-through and overlapping action. Nothing in the real world stops all at once. I would make sure that parts of the body, like the hair, clothing, or even a swinging arm, continue to move for a few frames after the main body has stopped. By exaggerating the poses before and after the movement, and refining the timing to reflect the actual force of the action, the whole sequence feels much more organic.
I like that you mentioned the wind-up. It is a detail a lot of beginners miss. Now, moving slightly toward the technical side of things. Let us talk about the interaction between 3D and live action. Can you explain what match plate photography is, and how it is actually utilized within a VFX pipeline?
Sure. Match plate photography is essentially the process of filming a live-action scene with a very specific camera setup, so that CG elements can be integrated seamlessly later on. The goal is to create a reference that gives the VFX artist everything they need regarding lighting, perspective, and camera movement. In a production pipeline, the match plate serves as the ground truth. If we have a shot of an empty room where a monster needs to be placed, the match plate allows the artist to align digital assets perfectly with the real-world environment. It ensures that the perspective lines of the 3D floor match the lines of the filmed floor. By using the plate as a guide, the final composite looks like the CG object was actually there on set, rather than just being pasted on top of the footage.
Right. And speaking of making things look real, let us talk about surfaces. If I asked you to implement a normal map on a model, what would you tell me the function of that map is?
A normal map is used to simulate fine surface details, like bumps, grooves, or scratches, without actually adding any extra geometry to the mesh. From a technical standpoint, it stores direction information for each pixel. It basically tells the lighting system how to interact with the surface as if there were real depth there. The biggest advantage is performance. If I wanted to add every single wrinkle on a character's face or every scratch on a piece of armor using actual polygons, the model would become incredibly heavy and would probably crash the renderer or slow down the viewport to a crawl. By using a normal map, I can keep the model lightweight and easy to render while still creating the illusion of high-frequency detail.
That is a solid explanation. Let us pivot to rigging, which can be a bit of a headache. Imagine you have a character in a scene, and as they perform their action, their hands keep clipping through objects. What are the first few things you would investigate in the rigging setup to solve this?
Clipping is always frustrating. The first thing I would check is the IK solver and the hand controls to see if there is any proper collision detection or constraints in place. Often, the rig is designed for movement but does not actually account for the volume of the hand, which allows it to penetrate other geometry. Would also look at the hierarchy and parenting. If the hand bones are not properly influenced by the arm or the body, you can get these unnatural movements that push the geometry into an object. Would also dive into the skin weights. If the weights are poorly distributed, the mesh might deform in a way that pushes the hand inward during a specific rotation, causing that clip. If the basic weights and IK are fine, I would check if the rig is missing any secondary controls. Sometimes you just need an extra offset control or a dynamic adjustment tool that allows the animator to tweak the hand's position relative to a prop without breaking the rest of the arm's pose.
Let us stay on the topic of animation glitches for a moment. Have you encountered popcorning? If you saw popcorning artifacts in an animation cycle, how would you fix that?
Yes, I have dealt with that in a few of my school projects. Popcorning is that sudden, unnatural jump or flickering where the movement doesn't feel smooth, almost like the object is popping from one spot to another. It usually comes down to inconsistent keyframes, interpolation issues, or sometimes a glitch in the rig. To fix it, my first step is identification. I would scrub through the timeline and open the graph editor to look for irregularities in the motion curves. Usually, you will see a sharp spike or a weird kink in the curve where the pop occurs. Once I find it, I would smooth out the interpolation. I might adjust the tangents or switch the easing function. Depending on the movement, I might move from a spline to a linear interpolation if it is a very mechanical move, or just soften the tangents to make it more fluid. If the issue is still there, I would refine the keyframes to ensure continuity. After that, I would always do a play blast to verify the fix in real time before I commit to a final render.
That is a very methodical approach. Now, I want to get into the artistry of performance. Animation is not just about smooth movement, it is about emotion. How do you maintain emotional continuity for a character who has to transition between vastly different emotional states in a single sequence?
That is one of the most challenging parts of animation. For me, it starts with planning and reference. I cannot just jump from anger to sadness in one frame. I establish a clear emotional arc for the sequence, mapping out the transition points so the shift feels earned and natural. I rely heavily on reference footage. I will record myself or look at live-action performances to see how emotions actually flow. For instance, if a character is furious and then suddenly becomes sad, there is usually a lingering remnant of the anger. Maybe their fists stay clenched for a second, or their shoulders remain tense even as their facial expression softens. Those lingering physical traits bridge the two emotions. Technically, I keep the character's core identity consistent. Even if they are terrified or overjoyed, their basic movement style and facial proportions have to stay the same so the character remains recognizable. I also use animation curves to ensure the transition between these beats is smooth and aligns with the timing of the story.
Let us talk about the broader pipeline. In a real studio, you aren't just using one piece of software. You might move assets between Maya, Blender, or Houdini. What are some of the pitfalls you anticipate when transferring assets between different DCC packages?
There are a lot of potential bottlenecks there. The most obvious one is format compatibility. Even with standard formats like FBX, different software can interpret the data differently. I have had experiences where a model exported from Maya loses certain attributes or has the pivot points shifted once it hits Blender. Then there is the issue of unit scales and coordinate systems. One program might treat a unit as a centimeter, while another treats it as a meter, leading to assets that are massive or tiny. Or you might find that the y-axis and z-axis are flipped, meaning your character is lying on their back when they should be standing up. Shaders are another big pain. Materials almost never translate perfectly between packages. You usually have to rebuild the look dev or tweak the shaders once the asset is in the final rendering software. And if you are moving rigs, the bone hierarchies or naming conventions can break if they aren't strictly standardized, which can completely ruin an animation.
Since you mentioned shaders and look dev, let us dive into that. For someone who might not know, how would you explain the concept of look development and why it is so critical to the overall pipeline?
Look dev is essentially the process of defining and refining the visual appearance of a 2D asset. It is where you determine the materials, textures, shaders, and lighting to make sure everything fits the project's artistic direction. I like to think of look dev as the bridge between modeling and final rendering. Modeling gives you the shape, but look dev gives it a soul and a physical presence. It is critical because it sets the visual rules for the entire film or game. If you don't establish those rules early, you end up with inconsistent assets. If one artist makes a character look hyperrealistic and another makes a prop look slightly stylized, the whole scene will feel disjointed. By doing proper look dev early on, you prevent costly rework later in the pipeline because you've already agreed on how light and material should behave in that world.
Speaking of materials, let us get specific. What is subsurface scattering, or SSS, and where would we most notice it in a scene?
Subsurface scattering is a lighting effect where light doesn't just bounce off the surface of an object, but actually penetrates the material, scatters inside, and then exits at a different point. This creates a soft diffused glow. You notice this most in materials that are semi-translucent or organic. The best example is human skin. If you hold your hand up to a bright light, the edges of your fingers glow red because the light is scattering through the tissue. Other examples would be marble, milk, or a candle. Without SSS, these materials look like painted plastic or cold stone. Adding it makes them feel alive and believable.
Great! Now let us talk about data management. When would you decide to use an alembic cache in your workflow?
I would use an alembic cache when I need to transfer complex animated geometry between different pieces of software without losing quality or tanking my performance. Basically, it bakes the geometry and the movement into a file that can be read as a sequence of meshes. This is incredibly useful in a studio pipeline. For example, if I have a character with a complex cloth simulation done in Houdini, I can't just send the simulation file to the lighting department in Maya. Would export an alembic cache. This way, the lighting artist has a lightweight, efficient version of the animation that they can render without needing to run the actual simulation themselves.
Let us move into some more advanced territory. Imagine you are dealing with a camera lens that is simulating an anamorphic effect. How does that change your workflow for things like depth mapping and compositing?
Anamorphic lenses are tricky because they squeeze the image horizontally. Because of that, any depth map generated from that footage is also distorted. If you just apply a standard defocus or atmospheric haze effect using a regular depth map, the effect will not align with the visual proportions of the image. To fix this, you have to adjust the workflow. You either have to unsqueeze the depth map to match the original scene proportions before you process the effects, or you have to adjust your compositing tools to operate on the squeezed data. You also have to account for the optical artifacts. Anamorphic lenses create these distinct horizontally stretched bokeh and lens flares. If you are adding CG elements, you have to make sure those elements also produce that specific stretch, or the composite will feel fake. The key is ensuring that the depth-based effects and the lens artifacts are perfectly aligned with that anamorphic distortion.
That is a very technical answer, and it shows you understand the optics. Let us talk about the general integration of CG into live action. When you are trying to make a CG element feel like it truly belongs in a real-world shot, what are your most critical considerations for lighting and color matching?
The most important thing is consistency in light direction, intensity, and color temperature. The CG element has to be lit by the same light sources as the real-world scene. If the sun is coming from the upper left in the footage, the CG object's primary light must be in the exact same spot. Spend a lot of time analyzing the real-world lighting. I look for the key light, the fill light, and the rim light. I also check the color temperature. If the scene was shot during the golden hour, the CG light needs that warm orange hue. Then there is color matching. Adjust the hue, saturation, and brightness of the CG element to match the surrounding environment. Shadows are also huge. If the shadows in the live-action plate are soft and bluish, the CG shadows cannot be sharp and black. Everything from the reflections on the surface to the way the object casts its shadow must match the plate, or the eye will immediately pick it up as a fake.
Let us talk about crowds. If you were tasked with creating a digital crowd, you have a choice: simulate individual agents or use a statistical scattering approach. What are the trade-offs there?
It really comes down to a trade-off between realism and performance. If you simulate individual agents, you get incredible control. Each character can have its own pathfinding, its own reactions to collisions, and its own unique animation. This looks the most realistic because the crowd feels like a group of individuals. However, it is computationally expensive. If you have 1,000 agents, the simulation can take forever to calculate, and it can really slow down your viewport. On the other hand, a statistical scattering approach is much faster. You use predefined patterns or probability-based placement to distribute the characters. It is very light on resources and great for massive crowds in the background. The downside is that it can look repetitive. You might start seeing the same animation cycles repeating in a pattern, which makes the crowd look like a sea of clones rather than a group of people. So if the crowd is a central part of the scene, I would go with agents. If they are just filling the horizon to make a city feel busy, I would use scattering.
Now, I want to test your knowledge of complex simulations. Walk me through the pipeline steps required to create highly realistic water splash dynamics, specifically including foam and particulates.
That is a multi-stage process. First, I would start with the primary fluid simulation. I would use a solver like Flip or SPH to handle the large-scale water movement and the main body of the splash. This gives us the basic volume and flow. But the water itself doesn't look like a splash without the secondary elements. So I would generate foam and particles based on the fluid's velocity, vorticity, and where the collisions are happening. I would set up a separate particle system for the foam that adheres to the surface of the water and the areas of high turbulence. For the finer details like mist or spray, I would emit particles from the regions of highest impact. Once the simulations are done, I move to shading. The foam needs to be more opaque and bubbly, while the spray should be semi-transparent and light. Finally, during the rendering phase, I would use a path tracing renderer to get accurate light interaction and make sure to add motion blur and depth of field. Without motion blur, the splashes look like frozen crystals instead of fast-moving liquid.
Very thorough. Let us try a different scenario. Imagine you have a photorealistic virtual camera pass, but the background plate is a stylized, painted environment. How do you integrate the two without a jarring visual discrepancy?
That is a bit of a contradiction in styles, so the goal is to find a middle ground. I would start by analyzing the painted background to extract the dominant color palette, the light direction, and the overall mood. I cannot leave the virtual camera pass as a raw photorealistic image because it will clash immediately. I would adjust the virtual camera pass by modifying the lighting and the color grading to align with the stylized aesthetic. I might soften the shadows or shift the highlights to match the paint style. I would also adjust the depth of field to ensure the focus feels consistent with how the background was painted. In the compositing stage, I would use edge blending and atmospheric effect to soften the photorealistic elements. Adding a bit of grain or a subtle distortion can help the CG feel like it is part of the painted world. The idea is to make the virtual elements feel like a natural extension of the art, rather than a high-res image sitting on top of a painting.
Let us go back to the basics for a moment. For a junior role, it is important to know the why behind the tools. What, in your simplest terms, is the primary function of a rigging system?
In simple terms, a rigging system is like creating a digital skeleton for a 3D model. It provides a framework of bones, joints, and controls that allow an animator to move the character. Without a rig, if you wanted to move a character's arm, you would have to manually move every single vertex of the arm's mesh in every single frame. That would be practically impossible. Rigging allows the animator to just move a control handle, and the skeleton handles the deformation of the mesh automatically. It turns a static sculpture into a puppet that can actually perform.
Let us talk about rendering passes. If you have a scene with smoke interacting with harsh, directional sunlight, which rendering passes would you implement to make that look realistic?
Smoke is all about how it interacts with light, so you need several passes. First, I would need a volumetric pass. This is what simulates how the sunlight scatters through the smoke, giving it that sense of depth and density. Then I would need a shadow pass. Since the sunlight is harsh and directional, the smoke needs to cast soft, semi-transparent shadows on the ground and on other objects. It cannot just be a floating cloud without an effect on the environment. I would also add a specular or highlight pass to catch those bright glints where the sun hits the edges of the smoke. A color bleed or absorption pass would be useful to show how the light shifts color as it passes through thicker parts of the smoke. Finally, I would use a global illumination or ambient occlusion pass to handle the indirect light bounce. By combining all these passes in compositing, I can fine-tune the transparency and the glow, making the smoke feel physically present in the sunlight.
You mentioned the feel of movement earlier. In animation, what do we mean when we talk about arcs?
Arcs are the natural curved paths that objects or characters follow when they move. In the real world, almost nothing moves in a perfectly straight line. If you swing your arm, it moves in an arc. If you throw a ball, it follows a parabolic arc. If an animator moves a hand from point A to point B in a straight line, the movement looks mechanical and robotic. By applying arcs, the motion becomes fluid and organic. It is a principle I try to apply to everything, from a character's head turn to a falling leaf, just to ensure the motion feels believable.
Last technical question before we wrap up. Can you explain the fundamental difference between keyframe animation and procedural animation?
The difference is really about who is controlling the movement and how it is generated. Keyframe animation is a manual process. The animator sets specific poses at certain points in time, and the software interpolates the movement between those keys. This gives the artist total creative control over the timing and the expression. Procedural animation is different. It uses algorithms or a set of rules to generate movement automatically. Instead of posing a character, the animator defines parameters, like avoid this obstacle or bounce based on this physics value, and the system calculates the motion dynamically. So, keyframing is more of an artistic, hands-on approach, while procedural animation is more about defining logic and letting the computer handle the execution.
To finish off, I have a scenario for you. You have a complex sci-fi creature that needs to interact with 3 very different materials: metal, organic slime, and crystal. How would you set up the shaders and materials to ensure the interactions between the creature and these surfaces look realistic?
That sounds like a great challenge. I would start by defining the base physical properties of each material. Metal would be highly reflective and hard, using metallicity and roughness maps. The slime would be wet and deformable, so I would use subsurface scattering to give it that organic, translucent look. For the crystal, I would focus on refraction and caustics to get those sharp, light-bending properties. The key to making the interaction realistic is the dynamic change. I would set up the creature's shader to react based on what it is touching. For example, when the creature touches the slime, I would use a material blend to make its skin look wet or slightly dissolved in that area. If it touches the metal, I would implement a system where it leaves reflective smudges or even subtle scratches on the metal surface using a mask. For the crystal, I would ensure the reflections on the creature's skin match the refractive patterns of the crystal. By using a combination of physics-based rendering and real-time material blending, I can ensure that the transitions between these materials feel physically plausible and not just like three different assets sitting next to each other.
That is a very comprehensive answer. I really appreciate the detail you put into your explanations. It is clear that while you are early in your career, you have a very strong grasp of the theoretical and technical foundations of the craft.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to walk through these topics with me. It was a great way to reflect on how I approach these problems.
It was a pleasure. We will be in touch regarding the next steps in the process. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too, thank you. Goodbye.